This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Hello everyone, great that you're there. This evening we're going to be talking about the local historian Richard Carew.
The Talk Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians. Or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
You may have heard me recommend the early parish histories, noting that their purpose was often to record history through a trawl of the parish chest and manorial rolls before those sources disappeared, rather than to analyse or interpret the evidence. In a similar way, old surveys of graveyards are especially useful because they include gravestones which have since crumbled away. In tonight's episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast, I would like to focus on an early local historian whose work may be valued through a similar focus, truly a focus on the past.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
You know, one day, though not today, I would very much like to devote an episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast to the classic literature of our passion. And one of those books would be English Genealogy by the late herald Anthony Wagner. It is a book for spending time with. It takes us down so many familiar paths that it is something like a Sunday afternoon stroll. And like a Sunday afternoon stroll, a great part of the pleasure is looking forward to spending time with it. In this volume, Wagner offers a brief but jam-packed review of the early county histories. These 600 words or thereabouts are built around the growth of the Society of Antiquities from 1586. Yes, that early. He tells us that initially the society comprised current and former heralds, record keepers. There were very few, if any, librarians in those days, although we know that William Worcester and John Rouse both had libraries in the 1480s, as well as the amateur historians. Now, he distinguishes these amateur historians from the serious scholars like Robert Cotton and Harry Spellman. Never mind, let's move on. These are local historians, the amateurs I'm talking about, produced the first county histories. And tucked away in this character of amateur historians, amongst John Stowe and Samuel Erdwick and William Lambard, we find the name Richard Carew. Now hold on, Carew deserves a greater mention than this. Firstly, his Survey of Cornwall, which came out in 1602, was, as far as I know, only the second serious county history to be formally published. Let me know if you know better. Lambard's Perambulation of Kent came out first in 1576. Yes, Erdwick's Survey of Staffordshire was written, or at least commenced, in 1593, but this was in manuscript and wasn't properly printed until, would you believe, 1817. So this fellow, Richard Carew, was one of the first footers, and we're going to look at the usefulness of Carew. But Carew's family is also significant because it was one of the few non-royals who claim descent going back to 1086. But let's see what Wagner has to say about that. He is talking about Gerald of Windsor when he says Gerald's eldest son, William, had himself, as Round proved, a son, Odo, called of Carew, from his castle of Carew in Pembrokeshire. He also held estates in Berkshire, and the succession to his lands of Nicholas Carew at the end of the 13th century was accepted by Round as clear evidence of descent from him, though intervening links are uncertain. So Anthony Wagner was far from convinced. Wagner was talking about Horace Round, of course. We made much of him in episode 50, didn't we? Again, let us see what Wagner had to say about these county histories. The works of some, like Richard Carew's Survey of Cornwall, 1602, were more descriptive than historical. But wherever manorial history was made the basis, as more and more it was, genealogy and documentation came into the picture. Now, Wagner's criticism is actually in line with Carew's original plan for the work. He wanted the first book, or first part, to be mainly descriptive, and he provides a detailed and very interesting description of Cornwall at the turn of the 17th century, while the second part would be a description of each hundred, taking account of the history and the people. And so it is in that section that most of the family information is stored, although it must be said that we remember Carew more as a local historian than a genealogist. We must be ready to concede that. He also needs to be remembered for his contribution to early modern English literature. He was not a great poet, but he was an innovative one, and an imaginative one, and sometimes a radical one. He was, if you like, second division. But he did produce an essay which I will call exquisite in his assessment of the English language. And it's in that essay, published arguably in 1605, some dispute about that, that he gives an early reference to one William Shakespeare. So he's important for that reference as well. Now, what alerted me to this local historian's claim on an episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast was his association with one of the diarists of the day, who observed Carew's first meeting with his future wife, Julia. She was a 14-year-old girl, 8 years younger than Carew himself. Now, neither the age nor the age difference was unusual in the squirearchy in the middle class of early modern England and before. The age of consent at the time was 12 for a girl and 14 for a boy. Neither Richard nor Julia are here to testify to their happiness, but they were married for 40 years, with Julia outliving her husband. Now, the age at marriage is one of those signals that flags up some suspicions for me when we are talking about a pedigree. And that is what I want to talk about in the second part of this podcast. Each month I like to recommend a book, a website and a podcast. And you know, this year it's the 50th since Roland Parker published his Common Stream, a village history of Foxton in Cambridgeshire. I guess if he was doing it again today, he'd take a slightly different approach. And you know, I'm likely to damn it from both ends, because for all the local sources, it misses the intimacy that attracts me to those early parish histories. I mention them a lot, don't I? But The Common Stream by Roland Parker is still a very good example of how to do it, how to research, how to analyse what you find, and especially how to present it. So that is my recommendation of a book for this month, Roland Parker's A Common Stream. Now, when we turn to the website, I want to recommend Mondays with Michelle, which is a part of the YouTube channel at Ties to the Past. Now, I have to say, she doesn't post Mondays with Michelle every Monday, but if you go to that channel at Ties to the Past, scroll down and you'll find her recent episodes. She concentrates on those websites that you probably haven't explored fully before, and that's why I find it so interesting. I use it quite a lot. As for the database, well, I want to recommend an emerging database. It's generated in private hands. An enthusiast wants to give something back to genealogy, so they are tabulating the names and places and dates of private deeds in their collection. And it's well worth a look. Okay, it's got a long way to go, we know that, but it does need support, and I'd like you to look at it. It is familydeeds.org. So there are the book, the podcast, and the database for this month.
Malcolm Noble's books on Nottinghamshire history include A Plague in Bleasby. A Nottinghamshire village survives its summer of death. The plague of 1604 reduced the population of Bleasby, Nottinghamshire, by 30%, a demographic deficit that would not recover for 2 generations. Family documents and local records bring detail to this figure, and when placed in the context of broader history, offer an understanding of the village social and economic dynamics.
Let's use this episode just to hark back to a recommendation which I made 2 or 3 episodes ago, when I recommended the database of the London Gazette. Now this week I have been just glancing through the Pelican series, Illustrated English Social History, and in Volume 2 by Trevelyan we come across this comment about the Gazette. There were practically no newspapers, for the meagre official Gazette could not be so called. To what? Of course it was a newspaper. Okay, there was no comment in it, but it was news, and it was the first newspaper in England. Argue with me if you will. And before we go back to class, I just thought we'd have a bit more fun. Another thing I found on my bookcase was a leaflet of old history questions for GCE A-level, so it's 17-year-olds. They were required to answer 4 questions and to write for 40 minutes on each.
Building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Are you ready for this? Let's see how we do. I like this first one. Left incline and right about turn. Is that a fair description of the reigns of Edward VI and Mary Tudor? Well, I don't know about right about turn. I would say reverse gear, to be honest, right? How was it that Elizabeth succeeded and James I failed in avoiding quarrels with their parliaments? Very good, very good. Now this one is deceptive. Give some account in the second half of the 16th or the second half of the 17th century of London. So write for 40 minutes on, say, the second half of the 16th century in London. Now that sounds easy, but it is restricted to just those 50 years. So 1550 to 1599. And you've got to fill up your couple of pages on London in the second half of the 16th century. So a little bit deceptive, that one. Now, are you ready for this? Did George III lose us America? Did George III lose us America? Please, no comments. We'll have no satire on this podcast. We don't want to upset anybody. But there is a very quick answer to that, isn't there? Let's go back to the classroom. Okay, this goes back a few weeks to when I was what I call doing some lazy work. That's just browsing through family history matters. I've heard another podcast call it picnicking, which I think is very apt, actually. I think that's very good. And I came across in quick succession 2 branches of my family tree to which people had added, I don't want to say, well, let me say ludicrous, because they really were spurious branches, not with any evil intent, I'm sure, but they were just adding a branch that was wrong. So I spent the next hour looking for similar mistakes and then tried to analyse what it was that caused me to be suspicious in each of those cases. And it came down to very few indicators. Actually, it was just 4 signals which I found alerted my suspicions. The first is easily dealt with, is that the spurious proposals went against the detailed knowledge which I'd already built up. And there is a very good reason for us all to not just content ourselves with the bare genealogical facts, but go into as much historical background as we can with our family so that we can see where things are likely to fit and where they're likely to be a bit awkward, a bit of a sore thumb. So that is the first tip, is to increase your knowledge of the family's history at the time. The second, and probably the most common mistake, relates to geography. Now, I have done some analysis in order just to help myself for my own purposes, and I know that most of my Cambridge branch chose their spouse within the same parish, at least in pre-industrial ages. And that's really what we're talking about. Sometimes, rarely, they went to the neighbouring parish, and in very exceptional cases, they went to the neighbouring but one parish. Now, the same applies to my East Midland branch, but there the proportions are slightly looser. So we have more people going to their next parish, and the incidence of people going to the next but one, though unusual, is not as rare as it is in my East Anglian branch. Now, I've gone into that detail to suggest to you that finding this cute analysis of what your family did is useful. It is a very important bedrock. And so, when someone comes up with a pedigree suggesting that they went, sometimes more than 80 miles in order to find a spouse, and the justification for that seems to be, well, if not them, who else? Come on, we're talking about an age where records weren't complete. We're also talking about an age where you could travel between 8 and 15 miles a day, depending on your mode of travel and depending on the conditions of the road. But if you extrapolate that, okay, so that is between 6 and 8 days travel. Marrying somebody 80 miles away is the equivalent of marrying, are you ready for this? The man in the moon for us. Now, there is one limiter on that bit of caution, and that is, of course, that the higher social classes did get about more and were more careful in trying to find a suitable spouse, so they looked further. Okay? But most of us aren't talking about those very high level of the aristocracy. Or if we are, then we can make allowances for it. The second signal is, as I've said to you, the age on marriage. Now, what we're looking for here is an age at marriage which was unusual. So you've got to work out what is usual in the parish and what is usual in that branch of the family. So that if anything is unusual, it flags up some suspicion to you. The age differences is not so much a concern because in my family, at least, it wasn't unusual for randy old men to marry a a ripe young maiden, but it was most common for the ladies to have found a husband by, say, lower than 26. You know, during the centuries that we are primarily interested in, the lower orders were not expected to marry until they were able to sustain an independent household, and that was really the governing factor. There's no rule about this, but we're looking for something odd, something strange, something uncommon that can just trigger our curiosity or trigger our suspicions. Now, both those items that I've mentioned, geography and age at marriage, are limited by class, and that is the third indicator. The third flag that makes me question a pedigree is when somebody marries out of class. Even in these days, and we're talking before the Industrial Revolution, a daughter was still regarded as an asset, and you didn't squander that asset by allowing her to marry when there was no family advantage, when the union did not suggest a closer bond between the families or a commercial bond or improved links for the rest of the family. It just didn't happen. Now, it is true, again, and I'm only talking about my family, the analysis of my family, it is true that the tail end of the litter, if you like, was more likely to marry beneath themselves than others. But even that allowance isn't really significant. So, I'm saying that when a proposed pedigree goes against your knowledge of the family history, what their occupations were, where they were living, etc., etc., and especially their biography, their later life, or where the geography seems wrong, the age at marriage seems wrong, and the class distribution seems wrong, then we need to be suspicious. And if you get 2 or 3 of those indicators turning on an orange light, then you need to be especially careful. Now, none of this is about rules. Yes, the uncommon can happen and did happen, and it has happened in my family. But I'm talking about indicators that should prompt us to question a proposed pedigree especially carefully.
Did you catch some of our recent episodes? Episode 49 featured 3 Australian brothers, while episode 48 discussed Admiral Sir John Hawkins. Take Peeps, for example, was episode 30, while number 35 looked at marriage registers and 31 discussed church wardens. TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and now and then, a bit of a blog. And now, on with the episode.
Okay, let's see if we can pull some threads together. Well, we now know the name of Richard Carew as one of the pioneers of local history. His Survey of Cornwall offers us an example, either a warning or an opportunity, when the different editions of a book offer different levels of genealogy. The early historians came with a different perspective, and it's always worth reading what they had to say. When it comes to avoiding phony additions to the family tree, our greatest defence is a good knowledge of the generation that we're certain of. Collateral lines, yes, but as thorough a biography as we can manage, so that we can see where the proposed pieces of the jigsaw don't fit. And then 3 warning signs. Suspicious geography. You need to know what is usual for a family when it comes to finding a spouse. Do they go to the same parish, neighbouring parishes perhaps? And remember that those parameters might change in later generations. Now, there is an underlying hint here Another lesson is to analyse what is going on in your family at different times. Life expectancy, infant death, migration especially, so that you can identify what is normal and look out for change. And then we said have a similar regard for ages at marriage, especially for the female line. Now, both those points are also limited by social class. Let's stick to what is usual. And that is the third point. Be wary when it is suggested that a family suddenly takes a lift to a higher social class. And social class is something that we'll look into some depth in the next episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast next month, when we discuss the rise of the squirearchy in England and its implications for researching the family tree.
The Talk Genealogy podcast is posted at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday of each month. Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode and wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night to you, and thanks for listening.